In this video, I'm going to be demoing how you will use the supplies that we mentioned for you all in design class to start your value project. What you'll be doing, like I mentioned with the slideshow lecture, is you will be creating a value scale from value 0%, which we'll call white, to value 100%, which will be black. And that will be white straight from the tube all the way in equal step increments until we get to black straight from the tube. And we'll do this in 10 paint swatches. So the white will be swatch 1 and the black will be swatch 10. And so we'll be painting a value range of grays in the middle, and that will equal 8 swatches to be 10 total. So what I've got here, of course, is the paintbrushes. I mentioned before I happen to have a 3/4 paintbrush and a 1/2 paintbrush, so that'll work well. I'm going to be using the 3/4 because I like how it gets down more surface area of paint. I've got my water glass here. It is currently filled with water. Yours doesn't have to be clear, but I like using like glass jam jars. I clean them out and I use those for my water when I paint. I just like to see the side of the glass jar to see if my water is dirty. Also, it helps me to determine where should I dip my paintbrush. I have before accidentally dipped a paintbrush full of paint into my cup of coffee, so don't do that. This is my palette knife. I've had this guy for a long time and he has done quite a lot of mixing for me. So he will be what I mix the paint with. This is a container to keep paint. Michael's or Hobby Lobby has stuff like this, so does the PCC campus store. But I'm not going to be using this. I just wanted to show you what it looks like. Chances are you might not need to use it for this project in particular. Maybe for your color wheel, you might. Certainly the Bristol board. And then we've got, whoops, over here, this is the palette paper. This is my palette paper right there. You can grab any kind of palette paper and it'll say it's disposable palette paper. It's like a sheet. It's very waxy. You could use wax paper as well if you didn't have this available. Anything that has that wax coating so that you can put paint on it and you'll mix right on there. So, and also of course paper towels. Make sure you have paper towels. It's my roll of paper towels here. So, tip that I like to use is if I don't have paper towels like this available and if I happen to be at Walmart or something, I head over to the auto section. I like those blue auto paper towels. I don't know, it's kind of fun like with the blue color, but they're very absorbent. And so they help me a lot if ever I'm painting and I need to use paper towels for something, but certainly any kind of paper towel will be fine. So I'm going to begin here. And my first swatch that I'm going to do will be black. I'm just going to do it straight from the tube. It's really simple. No mixing necessary. So I'm going to take my black from the tube. I'm going to go ahead and actually put black and white right on my palette paper. Let's make sure this opens here. And black is very potent. It's very powerful. So I'm not going to put as much black on my palette paper as I will my white. That's my black. By the way, I don't know if you noticed, but it does say ivory black on my paint tube. I'm actually using my personal paint. The kind of paint, if you're using Liquitex for the black, we suggest you use Mars Black. It's just a kind of black that will work really well with this project. But ivory black would be fine. That's what I'm using here. And of course white, titanium white. That's what I've got here too. Amsterdam or Liquitex is what we suggest you get. And those are the two good brands, especially for these like beginner projects here, two good brands of acrylic paint that won't break the bank, but will give you a good quality for what you need. So notice I've got a little bit extra white, and I do black. White is not as powerful as black is when it comes to mixing and getting those values where you need to go. So mix with your palette knife and grab paint with your palette knife. Don't use your brush to do that. If you mix with your brush, you're going to get paint gunked up in there within the bristles. It'll dry, you probably won't be able to get it all out. Remember, I'm talking about mixing. Don't mix with your paintbrush. That will eventually ruin the paintbrush. But then another thing too is when you mix for this particular project, we want the mixture to be completely homogeneous. We don't want any marbling. And so sometimes if you are mixing your paint with your paintbrush, you're going to get some of the individual paint colors right from the tube stuck in the bristles in between there. And you might think you have a homogeneous mixture, but then all of a sudden as you start to paint your strokes, some of that hidden paint that has not been completely mixed will start to seep out and you'll start to get some marbling. So you want to not do that. And it'll just keep the integrity of the bristles as well, so that it doesn't look like maybe your toothbrush looks, where they're all like, bleh, they're all fanned out. So keep the integrity of your brush. Palette knives are great for mixing. It keeps things really smooth. You also keep a lot of the paint. There's a lot of paint that gets stuck in the bristles if you were to mix with your paintbrush, and that's a lot of lost paint that you might not be able to actually use, but you can wipe off extra paint very easily, completely on your palette knife. So that's my little tidbit there. So, like I said, I'm going to be starting with straight black. So I'm going to scoot this over here. No mixing necessary since I'm using paint straight from the tube. So I'm going to take my 3/4 brush. I'm going to dip it in the water. And I don't want it sopping wet. Oh, let's bring this so you guys can see it. Okay, dipping this in the water. And now I'm going to squeegee off the sides, because I want this brush to be wet but not soaking. Okay, so there's definitely some moisture on there. I'm gonna dip it in my acrylic paint. Nothing too crazy here. Okay, so I've loaded my brush with paint. And now I'm going to start painting right on my Bristol board here. So I actually have a confession to make. Because I'm using my personal materials, I could not find any actual Bristol boards. So this is the back side of watercolor paper. So there's gonna be a little extra texture on the edges, but the general gist of what it is I'm doing is going to be exactly the same. So there's a couple things to remember with this. Oh, you can see some of the watercolor, maybe a little bit in there. There's a couple things to remember with this when it comes to draftsmanship, and that is we want a matte color that is completely homogeneously mixed. We want it to be as flat as possible. We don't want any ridges. We don't want any streakiness. There's a time and a place for all those things in other projects, but for this particular project, we are going to just have as close as you can. You're going to be creating paint swatches that look as if they came from Home Depot or Lowe's. So have that standard in your mind when it comes to draftsmanship. And what I'm doing here is, of course, I'm using the flat of the brush. I'm going full from one side to the other. I'm not stopping in the middle to pick up in the middle, because what that does, I don't know if you can see that here. Yep, you can see it with that glare right there. I've got now a strange little ridge line where I've stopped and started because I didn't go full from one side to the other. And we don't want that. So make sure that you go from one side to the other, even if you don't have quite enough paint to make it through from one side to the other. For the sake of the brush stroke, go ahead and do that. You can always load with more paint. You can always put more down. You can always thin it just a little bit with water. Don't thin it too much. If you thin it too much, then it's going to start looking streaky. And that, honestly, is just practice. You're going to have to take the time to get the feel for what is going to make my paint swatch streaky, what is just the correct ratio of water to paint. That's something that I can demo all day long for you, but in the end, you are going to have to feel that out yourself and feel what's right for you when it comes to painting this on your Bristol board. I would recommend, if you start to see your paper warp because of the moisture in the water, to take some tape and to tape down the edges. In class, I tape down the edges, but what I'm doing here is I have not. I actually forgot to do that, but I'm starting to see just the slightest bit of bowing with my paper here. It's not too drastic, so I'm not going to worry about it. And I like to think of frosting a cake. You know, if you are painting something and you have a really hard pressure, you might get lots of ridges. Oh, not too bad, but there's a little bit of a ridge right there. What you want to do is load the brush with like frosting, and you want to frost the cake. You don't want to dig into the breading of the cake or the actual substance of the cake itself, right? You want to glaze over on top with the frosting so it looks really nice. And so that's exactly what I'm doing. That's the mentality I use when I want good draftsmanship with my layer of paint. Is I want to glaze atop it. Don't put down too much pressure. Let the brush bristles do the work. And I'm going back and forth to smoothen these things out. Acrylic paint will dry slightly darker, So don't judge the value until it has dried. And if you see it glossy, that means it's still wet. And some parts of the swatch will dry quicker than others. So you'll start to see a matte finish in some areas, and it'll still be glossy in other areas. It means it's not quite dry yet. So I know with my light here, I've got a little bit of that glare, so I'll try to move this around. And this is pretty good. You can still see some brush strokes. You know, I did the best I could, but you know, there's no big mountain ridges. There's no streakiness. This is gonna be a solid swatch. Remember that you'll be trimming this down to size to be 1 inch by 2 inches. So in general, I like to make mine about like 2 or 3 inches by 4 inches. It just gives me a solid buffer of space that I know I'll be able to cut in there a really good 2 inch by 1 inch swatch. I don't want to be making my raw paint down so small that I find myself cutting into this textured area down here, because remember, I want a solid matte paint swatch for my value scale. So at this stage, I'm going to clean off my brush, and I'm gonna let my black raw paint down be finished. I'm gonna scoot this up here, clean my brush. And this is going to be a combination of getting it in the water, putting a little bit of pressure of the brush down into the bottom of where I keep my water, bottom of that glass there, squeegeeing it out, and then wiping it out with the paper towel here. Okay. So eventually, especially if you've been using a lot of black, you will need to dump out the water and refill it with clean water, because if you keep dirty water, that dirty water is not going to clean the brush very well after a while. So just keep tabs on that. It's another reason why I happen to like clear cups. I don't always need to then look inside the cup face right there. I can just look at the side of the cup and be like, oh, I gotta change the water. So the next color, I am going to do some mixing now. So this is another technique that you honestly are going to just need to practice on your own. But what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna take my Bristol board with the paint, I'm gonna move it off to the side, and I'm gonna focus on my palette paper here, and I'm gonna focus on mixing and show you guys this. So I'm gonna be mixing some sort of mid-tone gray. What I would suggest you do is certainly look at the example that we have up for you on Canvas of the different steps that you can follow along. It'll guide you a lot. But at the same time, I would just make a whole myriad of different values, different shades of gray that you have between the white and the black, dark ones, medium ones, light gray ones. And when you mix all of those from there, from your whole big gamut that you have, I would then pick and choose the different steps, the equal steps that you can find, the best ones that equally go in 10 steps from white all the way to black. And that will help you a lot. So with this, I'm going to start off with white. Start off with white and get a big chunk of white. Big chunk. So I'm scooping with the palette knife from the white that I've got right there. Okay, so I've got white. And just a little bit of black goes a long way. So you'll get the feel of that too. Instead of taking my palette knife and just scooping into the black, I'm actually gonna wipe this off because it's got white paint on it. And right now I don't wanna hinder the integrity of my black here. So I'm gonna take a considerably less amount of black than I did the white. And this is what I'm gonna be mixing in. So this is how I mix. I typically, and you feel out what works for you, but I take my palette knife and I'm not really turning it that much. I'm using this bottom flat part and I'm going in a circular motion, just like this. And then after a while, I squeegee, kind of wipe off the palette brush, and then I scrape. I scrape on the sides and I bring it back into the middle and I fold in. Kind of like kneading dough, but with this knife here. So I scrape from the outside, I bring it in, and then I fold it into the middle. That does a couple of different things. It mixes pretty well. And then besides just mixing well, it actually helps to get all the paint, as much as I can, off of the palette knife so I don't have just excess paint chilling on that palette knife. It also helps me to keep and contain the paint mixing area. If I'm not careful, all of a sudden this mixing can keep expanding across the entire piece of palette paper. So it helps me to take all of those runaway sheep and bring them back to the pasture fold. All right, and that's a pretty good value of gray there. I'm actually gonna grab just a little bit more black to darken this. There's some nice marbling that happens at the beginning. It's really pretty, but unfortunately for this project, oops, I accidentally flung that off. We don't want any marbling. So make sure you mix it completely. Be aware of extra paint that might be hanging out on some random area of your palette knife. That sometimes happens if paint touches the very back of my palette knife and I haven't been mixing with it, and all of a sudden sometime down the road I wipe that off and oh, there was some pure white or pure black that found its way into my otherwise homogeneous mix. Okay, so we've got a pretty solid gray going on here. This is a nice value. This would probably be more towards the lighter value side of the scale there. You can see how with the value it favors more the white than it favors the black, the dark black. I can always darken it. That's another thing too. Start with white because you can always add black to darken, and it'll darken much quicker than if you were to start with black and need to add white to lighten it. So this is a pretty good homogeneous mixture. There's no marbling. So I'm going to keep this, and this is what I'll use to paint the next swatch. Let's rotate this here. There we go. Slide this under. Okay, so again, taking my brush, I cleaned it from before, dipping it in the water, squeegeeing off the sides just to get off some excess, but it's still moist from the other times I painted. So now I'm going to dip this into the paint I just mixed with the palette knife. I'm gonna load the brush, there we go. And remember, side swipe motions. Don't do the Tom Sawyer and painting a fence kind of thing. Don't do this, because you're gonna set yourself up for poor draftsmanship. Go from one side to the other, full strokes. Just like this. This project is doing a couple different things. It's introducing you to a new medium so that you can learn to paint using acrylic paint in a well-controlled manner. B, it's teaching you just another draftsmanship exercise to try to be as professional as possible, and no matter what you're doing. Draftsmanship and control, by the way, go hand in hand. If you can control the medium well, you'll be able to execute excellent draftsmanship. You might choose not to. Sometimes some projects require something that looks a little bit more rustic, right? But for these projects, we do want them to be pristine and precise, and so we do want excellent draftsmanship. And that does require a certain amount of control, and to have that kind of hand-eye coordination control is very beneficial. That's very transferable to many different skills that you might have in your design or art career, not just with painting traditionally. So I'm going back and forth right here, making sure I've got enough paint down so that I'm not seeing the white of the paper below. I don't want it to be streaky. I don't want to be able to see underneath it. I don't want to be able to see brush strokes except the inevitable ones of the very minor brush strokes. Very, very slight ridges, I guess is what you could call them too, going from side to side. But remember, think about it as you're frosting a cake. It's very light. For you ladies, maybe think about painting your fingernails with nail polish. It's kind of like what this is. And if you find yourself with some ridges, you can very lightly go over that with just the brush, or maybe with the brush that has a little bit of water on it. Just a little bit. You don't want to streak this with too much water. It's going to be slightly transparent then if you do that. So that's pretty good right there. Okay, so now we've got two values, our black straight from the tube. This is a pretty good value. I don't know, this might be like a 30%, 40% value if you're thinking in terms of the value scale, maybe if you're in drawing class. So again, like if you are taking drawing, or if you have taken principles of drawing, this is very similar to the value scale you did In that class, it's just you're doing it with paint and you're having more steps than just the 5 that you had before. So again, I would wait before I assess what this value is in its like actual form. Like I think it might be, 30 to 40%, but I do need to wait for it to dry to really assess what that is, because it will dry a little bit darker than what it shows right here. You can see it's glossy still. Let's see if my black. Yeah, there's some areas, you can see some areas that are drying in the corners. It's still pretty glossy. It's probably drying the most right up there. You can even see in this gray, if you're looking for it, that edge right on the side is drying just a little bit darker. But I just painted that, so it's still pretty wet. So I'll do one last one. That's gonna be white straight from the tube. And I'll paint that guy right here. And this will be quick. Okay, this off. Remember to please paint the white swatch, your 0%. So that's what I'm doing right here. When you paint it on the Bristol board, it might be hard to tell. So use that glossy wetness of the paint to your advantage to see where the paint is. I put this down here. Yeah, put some more. And this white paint, do you see how I'm getting those ridges? Look at that. That would be poor draftsmanship. Honestly, this texture is super cool. Again, for another time and place, this would be a really fun texture that you could include in your painting projects. It's kind of the same effect when people will paint with a palette knife. You got that nice gob of paint texture going on there. That 3D effect of the painting. There we go, I'm smoothing that out. Notice I'm now in the process of smoothing things out, stroking from side to side here. I'm not loading my brush with any more paint. I already put down enough paint. So I've got the clay on the potter's wheel now, if you will, and now I'm just molding this. I'm very lightly glazing over the top. And usually most issues that you might find with your paint swatches, they'll probably be remedied by just another coat. You can smooth that out. There you go. That's a little bit better. At least it's consistent with the other ones. There we go. And that is my white swatch. Remember, it's going to be 2 inches by 1 inch. That will be cut out from all of these and all the other values that I would paint. What I would do too when it comes to draftsmanship is I would take this once it's all dry and once I associate, what value this probably is, I would actually flip this over. Maybe use a light table or just like hold this up to the light. And you'd be able to see where that swatch area is of the raw paint that you put down. And then I would, with a ruler, I would draw a 2 inch by 1 inch box right there. Make sure all of the right corners are right corners, of course. And that would be what I would cut out with your scissors or your X-Acto knife or whatever you have. And that way the pencil lines will have been drawn on the back, but within the area that you painted, so that the swatch, once you, pick out that swatch after cutting it out, it's not going to have any of the graphite lines of your pencil lines within the paint area, because that gets kind of hairy when you're trying to erase pencil lines from a swatch that you just painted with acrylic paint. It can be done. Certainly you can erase graphite marks from acrylic paint. So if you wanted to try to draw your guidelines within the swatch, the paint swatch itself, not flipped upside down, that's fine, go for it. It's just there is a risk, of course, that the draftsmanship, to see those lines, they might not be able to get rid of that. So just a couple other comments. If you are allergic to latex, just be aware of that. There is latex in certain kinds of acrylic paint, so definitely be aware of, you might need to wear gloves, latex-free gloves. Also, acrylic paint does stain, so be aware of that with your clothes. If you think you're gonna get pretty messy, honestly, I don't get too messy with this project or with the color wheel. It's pretty contained, to be honest. We're not painting a big scene with lots of different colors. So the only kind of messiness really just gets on my hands. I happen to not be allergic to latex, so I'm fine to just use my bare hands. But some people, whether or not you're allergic to latex, sometimes you're painting, you just don't want those kinds of materials on your skin. So feel free to use gloves if you'd like. But even then, if you'd like to wear a smock or wear an old shirt, something that you're okay getting paint on, I would recommend that so that you don't get paint all over your clothes, because like I said, it will stain. All right, and that is the end of my demo.